months where we can do any of that. So I don't want to take the times we have on Wednesday nights and Sunday nights to rehash a lot of that, because if you hit a bump in the road in your readings, you can go to our website, you can go to the podcast, and you can go to YouTube, and you can find all of that. It's made available to you, and so we will come up with something else for the next few weeks. Sunday night, I'm actually going to go and look at yesterday's reading. We're going to look at 1 Samuel 8 Sunday night. So we're actually going to do things out of order this week. So forgive me, but so we'll do that they want a king and whatnot. So next week, I think we'll finish the David and Goliath story, and then and it's Mother's Day, so we won't have Sunday evening. So we'll figure all this out. But if we are through. Are we halfway through 2 Samuel, I think? A little over halfway? Actually, I think we're over halfway. So for the next several readings, you've got plenty of material from the church online if you hit a bump in the road. And there's plenty that can throw you off with the story of David. But I thought we would do chapter 17 today, the story of David and Goliath. We know it so well. And we spent 1 week on it in our study of David, and there is a lot there that we could look at in a little bit of detail. So I thought that might be fun to do. So here's the thing. We're going to look at Goliath today, and in the end, stick with me, okay? We'll do a little bit of speculation, but we'll go in places that seem weird. So let's just have fun with it, right? We know the story well enough, so let's see what else we can find, some good nuggets here. Well, no doubt we are familiar with the story, and it is one of maybe a handful of stories that you could ask anyone in the United States something about the Bible, and they may not be able to give you the details or even the names of the characters. After all, most Americans think Joan of Arc was Noah's wife, and that is a real fact. That is a real fact. But they could probably tell you something about a little guy beating a big guy, right? And given the world of sports, David and Goliath is something that rings true, right? So my team, like any middle school teams, any team you play, they'll look at the schedule, and you as a fan do this. You'll look at the schedule, you'll say, well, we're going to beat this team, we'll struggle against this team. Because the David and Goliath motif is sort of natural to human, right? And what makes March Madness so great, and ESPN and CBS and all them, use the David and Goliath story for March Madness, is we love it when little David, let's just for the sake of argument call him St. Peter, beats the so-called Goliath. And we'll, just for the sake of argument, call Goliath the Lexington Basketball Academy, okay? So right, and it's called, David beats Goliath yet again. So that's the way we typically think of it. I came across this reference with this story. It's from Mark Twain in the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Love this scene. The teacher says, "Would you," to Tom Sawyer, "tell us the names of the first 2 disciples that were appointed?" He adds, "Tom was tugging at a buttonhole and looking sheepish. He blushed now and his eyes fell. Mr. Walter's heart sank within him. He said to himself, 'It is not possible that the boy can answer the simplest of questions.' The teacher then says, 'Now I know you'll tell me,' said the lady. 'The names of the first 2 disciples were,' Tom said, 'David and Goliath.'" So, and then he adds this, "Let us draw the curtain of charity over the rest of the scene." I love that, right? He's going to cut it off right there. That's so good. But for most, the story symbolizes the fight of giants over our lives. And we'll have more to say about that next week. But I really think there's more to it than that. So let's start with what we'll call the soldier. This is Goliath, of course, and the story begins by introducing us to both the setting and the Goliath as the soldier. So verse 1 to 3 is the setting. We'll just look at it. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord, and invite Jesse to the sacrifice." Oh, I'm in the wrong chapter. Good. I'm like, where's Goliath in this? I read that earlier today, so it's making sense. But like, there's supposed to be a weird word I can't pronounce. That's not the story. Chapter 17. Are you all caught up with me, or am I caught up with you? I don't know. 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies. Is that what yours says? Something like that? That's right. Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Ezekah and Ephes Damim. That's the word I was looking for. Like, I know it's going to pop up somewhere. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. That's the setting. So we're giving a historic and geographical background. Now, of course, the Philistines we saw last week with Samson, they've been a perennial enemy of the Israelites for many generations. They pop up in Joshua. They're real pain in Judges.
I mean, there was a covenant between Abraham and the Philistine king.
Yeah. Yeah, and they just... Yeah. And so you remember what we saw in the story of Samson is, this is a detail I didn't catch until we went back over it, that God says Samson will be the beginning of Israel's liberty from the Philistines. And that really isn't completed until David. And I think we'll see some of that later this year in 2 Samuel. So here they are, once again, fighting the Philistines. This is a major battle in that. They are fighting over basically border land. But it isn't just, the border of two nations. It's a strategic border. And whoever controls this border not only has economic advantages, they have military advantages. So this is a significant battle that they will have. The land Ephes Damim means the border of blood. Right? And now it makes sense why they're there. This is probably not the first skirmish they have. Some debate as to the exact location. Soko and others, we have a good idea where that is. But the exact location of this, there's some debate. So I didn't put a map up or anything. The Valley of Elah was a narrow ravine, roughly a mile wide. Again, it is strategic. But starting in verse 4, we're introduced to Goliath. And I want to spend as much time as we can on him. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Does anyone have anything different there?
Mine's over 9 feet tall.
You got NIV? Uh-huh. Okay. So they went more they updated. Okay. So no one has 4 cubits or 6 feet, anything like that? I was just curious. Okay. So they're going with the Masoretic text. All right. Verse 5. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. His spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Goliath was a biologist, by the way. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So this is the great showdown, right? You got Goliath on the one end, Israel on the other. They are scared to death of him. Well, his title is given in verse 4 because the writer goes out of his way to build the tension of the scene. Right? A good movie, right? You can see that the camera would be low, so it makes him look taller, right? The way I've learned camera tricks was trying to do selfies with girls, right? Like my wife. I once tried to do a selfie, and apparently the phone was too low, and she was worried to death that she would look too big and people would see her nose hairs, right? This is an actual conversation that women have. So you have to do it up high because then you'll look smaller and no nose hairs. But some of y'all didn't even know that. I learned that. We do selfies with the baptismal candidates. It sort of became a thing when the teenage girls started. And they said, and they grabbed my hand and did that, right? And then, I don't know why every picture young girls do, they have to do the hip thing. I don't know. But you can see the camera's going to zoom in so he looks even bigger. He's going to cast a large shadow. That's what the writer is doing here. His title there in verse 4 is that of champion. This is the only time this word appears in the Old Testament. Here in verse 4 and in verse 23, he's called it again. It literally means space between two armies. And that makes sense, right? If this was not a real common sort of a way to do war, but we have examples of this. Perhaps the most famous example is Homer's Iliad, the story of Troy. You remember that Achilles was on the Greek side, and Hercules, not Hector rather, is on the Trojan side, and they go out and fight against each other, right? Paris asks Hector to do that. They have their great showdown. There have been other movies who have done something like this to, all the stakes come down to two men fighting. But he is described as champion, so he's willing to represent his nation. So his death really means their defeat, and his victory means their victory. His name is Goliath. The etymology of this is difficult to determine. One commentator said it could mean exile. You do with that whatever it is you want. And then his height is famously given, right? And it looks like all of our translations are going with the Masoretic text. And there is debate regarding this. And one of the big debates is it possible, right? Given what we know and have found with skeletons and stuff, is it possible that someone can be 9 feet tall? There are people who are unusually tall. They have a condition that makes them that. And that condition actually makes it less likely they're going to be carrying heavy armor and fighting in a battle. So a lot of people come to this and say, well, that just doesn't seem possible. So what you have then is this measurement of cubits is about 9 foot, 9 inches, usually what you get, but over 9 feet, pushing 10 feet. It's a very tall individual. However, you could find some manuscripts that mention 6 feet, a little over 6 feet, about 6.5 feet. And for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of those scrolls that we have of 1 Samuel give a shorter size. Now, before we panic and think people are changing the Bible, and I lean towards the 9-foot description, but the 6-foot description would make you a giant. The average man at this time was under 5 foot. Now think about it. When Hunter Conway comes in here, he's 6'3". That's a big man, right? And we would recognize that's a big man. That's a linebacker, right? Now he's 6'3". Now I am 5'9", just shy of the average height of a grown man. Okay, so to me, Hunter is a giant, right? I mean, I ain't messing with him, right? Are you? No, you're not, right? So that if any basketball player came in here, if that one guy who's a Christian for UK, Oscar, what's his face, right? If he comes in here, he's 6 foot giant, right? Now, if he were to come in here, we'd all just be like, that's a big boy, okay? That's us. And most of us are over 5 feet tall. Back then, your average man wasn't even 5 foot tall. So if Goliath was the shorter height of 6.5 feet, he's still 2 feet taller than the average man or average human. That's significant. Okay? So regardless of his actual height, again, I lean towards the more extreme because you can explain why you would shorten his height rather than increase his height. That's the general view of textual critics. But nevertheless, there is room there for a smaller height. Regardless, he would have been considered a giant. By the way, the reason we know the heights of people, you can thank the Egyptians for this, for one. Because they embalm the dead, we have so many skeletons that are really well preserved. But we have also found other bones and skeletons and whatnot of non-Egyptians at this time. So, and we catalog all that, and so we have a good idea what the average person is. His armor is given verse 5 to 7. His body armor likely weighs, according to estimates I've seen, 175 pounds to 200 pounds. That's heavier than I am. Unless I do well in this diet I'm supposed to be on. His spear would have weighed between 20 and 25 pounds. That's incredible. Okay, be launching my son basically. It seems like he weighs more than that. Just for the record, his shield bearer. This is a little detail that's often overlooked. The shield he carried would have been the size of a man, right? And that makes sense because you want your army to be protected. And so the little buckler shield won't do him much good. So you would have someone to carry the shield for him while he carries all the weapons and stuff. It protects him from arrows and all that sort of stuff. And so this shield would have been the size of a giant. So it's a giant shield fit only for a giant. Okay? And so starting in verse 8, he gives his challenge to the Israelites. And his challenge is full of confidence, mockery, and bravado. And notice what he says in verse 8, there at the beginning. I almost went back to chapter 16, sorry. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? That language is interesting because we would expect him to say, am I not a Philistine and are you not a Jew? But he mentions being servants of Saul. I actually think he's mocking not just the Israelites, but he's really mocking Israelites through the means of Saul. Now, if you've read through 1 Samuel, you may remember that Saul was chosen. One of the reasons his description of that he looks like a king because he's tall. He's unusually tall. Have you ever done this to where you watch a presidential campaign, and don't vote this way, but you look at him and you're thinking, that guy I could see as a president of the United States, this guy not so much. You ever done that? There was one presidential election. It was drawn to the conclusion. I thought, I'm just going to look at these two guys, right? One of these guys looks like he was central casting for the row. The other guy, not as much. But I can see like this. He just looks like your stereotypical president, right? So too, Saul had a little bit of that, which really makes the choosing of David, right, a big deal. Because when Samuel comes after hacking Agag to pieces, so, they were probably nervous in Bethlehem. Sorry, not available, leave a message. But when Samuel goes to anoint another king, Jesse brings out the boys who look like the role. David doesn't look like he could be a king. Saul, although may not be as tall as Goliath, he, as the king, is to stand between the armies. He's to be their champion. And he's already proven to be a good military leader. So we would expect that with their tallest guy, Israel would choose their tallest guy, and the only person that fits that description in the narrative is Saul. They will battle it out. And if Saul really is the anointed one of God, we would expect Saul to win. And so Goliath really gets to the heart of the issue. He is called to be their champion. But his mockery goes from, you have a puny king, because he won't come out and fight me, to now you have a puny army. Notice how it goes the rest of the way. Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me, if he is able to fight with me. Right? If. Notice it's choose a man. You made a poor choice of a king. Now choose a man. Again, this was a common in ancient Near Eastern battles. The victor of this wins everything else. By the way, in the Chronicles of Narnia movie, the second one, Prince Caspian, they have a big scene with this, where Peter fights, and the other guy cheats and all that sort of stuff. It's not in the book, which a lot of people didn't like the second one, but you don't care about that. Okay. And notice that what Israel says in verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So the very sight of the giant stirred in them fear, and his bravado and his confidence made it work. A few weeks ago, my little soccer team, we played a team in Danville, really good team. We finished in a draw. But it took 15 minutes for us to really go toe-to-toe with them. It really frustrated me because some of the guys had said, well, we play them in basketball. They're really tall and they're really fast. And I looked at them and I said, yeah, they look taller and they look well coached. I mean, I don't know. But like, I've been with you guys for really since the summer of January with winter training. You guys are perfectly capable to win this game, perfectly capable of it. But they could not get it out of their heads. And I remember the last thing I told them before they went out the field is, if we lose, it's because of how you play the first 15 minutes. You guys are scared to death of them. Right? And sure enough, for 15 minutes, they just dominated us and they scored. Right? Once they believed, hey, we can really play with them, it was a pretty even game. We probably had the advantage, ended up tying it. But this is typical of human nature, isn't it? We naturally measure ourselves and our self-worth up to other people. And men in particular do that. And a lot of times this does stir fear. They're better than me. I can't beat them, all that sort of stuff. Well, clearly the storyteller wants the reader to see in Goliath a foe that cannot be defeated. And if Israel is to defeat him, it must come by the power of God. Right? And it's funny that, and we mentioned this story last week, that we go from Samson, who was strong and mighty, and then we jump over here, who slayed lions, and we jump over here, again, we mentioned this last week, and the person who ends up winning is scrawny and handsome, ladies, but he's scrawny and not all that good, but he too can fight lions, right? We talked about what does real strength look like last week. But it looks like, man, no one is going to be able to defeat him. In fact, if we were to skip ahead, verse 19 to 27, everyone is afraid. David's brothers are afraid. The army is afraid. Saul is afraid. All of Israel is afraid. So what does Saul end up doing is he tries to bribe people, right? I'll give you riches. I'll give you royal access, right? I'll give you a royal marriage, a tax exemption. That'd be worth fighting. Like I know I'm going to die, but, win-win, I get to see Jesus or no taxes, That's almost the same thing. But no one arises to the occasion because they feel like defeat is assured. No one can defeat this giant except for David, of course. Now, I want to pause there, and next week we can continue the story in more detail. But I think there's two things that the author wants us to associate with Goliath, okay? He's such a unique character. Two things we need to see in Goliath. The first thing is, this is going to blow your mind, Goliath is a giant. I bet you didn't see that one coming, did you? You pay big bucks, right? And that's what you get. I paid big bucks to get a cemetery education, and that's what I came down with. Goliath is a giant. But in the biblical story, that is very significant. This is helpful, particularly since we've spent so much time in Genesis. But if we were to broaden that out, particularly to the first 6 books of the Bible, this theme of fighting giants is a major theme, right? It, of course, starts in Genesis 6. You remember the story? The sons of God mixed with the daughters of men. Now, we had spent significant time exegeting that and saying, could it mean this, could it mean that? But just for the sake of arguments, okay? Let's assume what you have are divine beings, supernatural beings, mixing with human women. Okay, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that. Everyone agrees that what is produced from that are the Nephilim, which are essentially giants. It's more complicated than that. For the sake of argument, giants. And it was believed in the ancient Near Eastern world that the founders of Babylon and Syria and Egypt and all these nations, they were founded by demigods who were giants. They built large cities and they were mighty. And so what the Genesis stories of these nations was, they convinced themselves that we are the offspring of demigods. You, on the other hand, your race of people, your nation are not. You come from the dust of the earth. We come from the gods. And that is really their main justification for warfare and conquering and conquest. Now, that is why the Bible stands in stark contrast to that worldview. The Bible starts with God created everyone, and they're all made in the image of God, including your captors. Like the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Philistines. They too are made in the image of God. Right? So So this theme of giants shows up. And what is the message of the Bible? There were giants in the land. But what did God do? He destroyed them. Completely wiped them out. With what? Some dude who built a boat. Right? And you remember that story is a retelling of creation in the Garden of Eden. So you get decreation, the water floods, so that you're back to Genesis 1:2, and then you get, the light comes out, there's birds, there's land coming out of the waters, all that sort of stuff. And what does Noah do? He repeats the Eden story. He has a plant, he sins due to the fruit, there's nakedness and shame, all that sort of stuff. Well, what is strange, one of the great mysteries of the Bible is, if God wiped out all the Nephilim in the flood, why do they show up again in the Bible? I do not have a perfect answer for you. I do have an idea. If you read the Bible as narrative, it helps. And we Americans struggle with that. Read it as literature, and some of these themes will be helpful. What you're getting in the wilderness is a retelling of the creation accounts. So Joshua will go into the Canaan. He will cleanse it like a flood, right? But this time it's through conquest. And what you get is a new garden, right? It's the promised land. So you get these themes of the giants coming out. So the first time they did I skip it here? Oh, yeah, because I skipped in my own notes. Hold on. This is why having notes is great. When you try to pair it with PowerPoint, it gets complicated. So here it is, Numbers 13. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, so we seemed to them. So you see, giants in the land. So you get the Nephilim, but where are they from? Anak. Okay, so this goes back to the flood. How do they survive? I have no idea. Other than thematically, we're to see this as a new type of flood. Also, the Emim are mentioned as giants. This is Deuteronomy 2. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Of course, we just saw them, right? Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim. We'll see them here in a minute, but the Moabites call them Emim. The Rephaim are basically a synonym for Nephilim, okay? We're going somewhere with this, okay? The Rephaim and the Rephaim are mentioned here, clearly giants. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. 9 cubits was its length. Well, can you think of someone else who is 9 cubits? Your boy Goliath. And 4 cubits its breadth according to the common cubit. Okay? Now remember, David fights a battle, I believe, against the Moabites in a valley called the Rephaims, the valley of the giants. This term basically means giants, right? And so they are fighting the giants. Now, among the Philistines, there were other giants we get in the Bible. And if you want to see this, 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Chronicles 20. Their names are Saph, sometimes called Sipai, I don't know, Lami, Ishbibenob, and there's an unnamed warrior giant. They are all described as having 6 fingers and 2 toes on each hand and foot. Now, why does any of that matter? I know you're thinking, this is part of the Bible that I get lost, and I just assume we not bring it up. That's fine. You ever wonder why it is? Jesus is in Nazareth, right? The launch of his ministry, he walks into the synagogue, and he reads from the scroll of Isaiah. Remember what it says? He's going to liberate the captives and all that sort of stuff. And help the poor. And then he comes out and he starts casting out demons. Where'd they come from? You ever wonder that? Why does Jesus make such a big deal about casting out demons? We went through the miracles of Jesus in Matthew. It's like 3 or 4 we looked at of Jesus casting out demons. And on top of that, there's the general statements. He opened the eyes of the blind, he cleansed the leper, and he exercised authority over them. One of the theories, and it gets complicated here, is that there is a connection between that in the New Testament and the giants of the Old Testament. I don't want to chase all that rabbit. So here's what I want you to see. What you're getting here is a picture of Christ's triumph over divine beings, which he does at the cross and resurrection. Right? Remember, Jesus says, don't be surprised that you have authority over demons, right? And I think we are to pick up on that. Because just as God exercised authority over the Nephilim in Genesis 6, now what it is we have is the future king of Israel exercising that authority. And he will wage war against them throughout his administration. What does Jesus come to do? When he starts casting out demons, the people around him realize this is different. This is very different. He is like a David slaying giants. I think we are meant to see that. But there's another reason why this is significant. And that is because we are to see in Goliath, the David and Goliath story, is David, this is his first battle against the serpents. So remember, go back to Genesis 3, the ancient serpent comes. He is cunning, he is sharp, he is dangerous. And that theme of the seed of the sun, right, and the seed of the serpent. So we see this. We see snakes and dragons and all that throughout the Bible. We also see offspring language. We've looked at this in some detail before, so I don't want to spend forever on this. But let me show you where the serpent shows up in the story, okay? First of all, his armor is described in serpentine language. I'm quoting the NIV here because it makes it very clear. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scaly armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. In Hebrew, his armor is described as scaly. Most of our English translations don't bring this out because what in the world is scaly armor exactly, right? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to English, right? But the Hebrew writer knows that the original readers know exactly what it is he's implying here. It could be describing what it looked like, but it's deeper than that. It's scaly armor. And so we immediately think of a snake. And so his armor is pictured in aquatic sea serpent type sort of armor. Not only that, but his weapons are described in serpentine way. Both his armor, and you see here, and his weapons are described as being bronze. So you'll see it here multiple times. Notice, bronze helmet on his head. His armor was bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. Later, it's... he had a bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. Then Saul clothed him with an armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head. I wish I thought this earlier to count all the references to bronze. I bet it's 6 or 7. You can look it up in the Hebrew. I'm willing to bet it's 6 or 7. We can count at least 5 in these examples here. But nevertheless, why is that important? The Hebrew word for bronze is almost identical to the Hebrew word for snake. Now, remember, Hebrew, they like to play with words. I think we talked about this a few weeks ago. We don't have a lot of examples like that in English. So in Hebrew, the root of every word, or almost every word, is 3 letters. And there's no vowels in Hebrew. Vowels are sort of died out, and then we had to bring them back so we can understand what's happening with the language. And so what you get is the Hebrew writers will play with words that look similar but have different meanings behind them. Actually, I made some really bad dad puns Monday. We were on East Main coming back to the house, and I saw a KSU student carrying 2 box fans. It was just one of those random things you'll see on a college campus, right? He's not bothering anybody. He's just carrying 2 box fans. And I proceeded to make some really bad dad jokes, like give him credit. He at least has 2 fans. I can't even get one, right? And I thought, it's a fantasy. It's fantastic. All those sort of bad things, right? We're playing with words there. That's bad dad puns. Well, the Hebrew Bible does that. And the word bronze is almost identical to the word snake. I think I can prove it to you that we should draw this conclusion. In Numbers 21, there's a story, right? The Israelites are complaining and they're sinning again. And so what comes to poison them in the night? A serpent. And what does Moses do to liberate people from the snake? What does he build? A bronze serpent. It's a bronze. It's a serpent. You see the play on words? It's a bronze serpent. So if you look up on the hill for this bronze serpent, those 2 words are put together on purpose. So what is it that we find here? We find a man in scaly armor made of bronze. Of course, it isn't just left there. Think about his death. David's stone strikes Goliath, this serpentine-like character with his forked tongue who is coming against the seed of the woman, right? You remember the whole point of Israel is he gave an offspring seed to a woman who could not give birth. So in Genesis, that narrative of the seed goes right through Sarah and then Rebekah and everyone else. And so here the Israelites, they're the promised seed of Israel. And here comes this guy who looks like a serpent. He's in the land flowing with milk and honey, what's supposed to be the garden. He comes and he is speaking blasphemies. And what does David do is he fights against him. The stone, by the way, if you go to Southern Seminary's museum, it's a stone they think was probably what David would have picked. And it's basically a baseball. And that will do some damage. He suffers a blow to his head. Okay? Keep following the story. Goliath will come to bruise and to destroy. But what happens is there is a blow to his head. And how does he fall? Straight down to where he eats the dust. What is the curse of the serpent of Genesis 3? He will eat the dust of the earth. He will crawl on his belly. You're seeing it, right? This is the story of David and Goliath. So I think this is it here in Genesis 3:14. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock, beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go. You will eat the dust of the earth all days of your life. And what happens to Goliath? He comes looking like a serpent, and he will die like the serpents. Now you can go to verse 15, right, of Genesis 3, and it says that he will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, but he, the seed of the woman, will crush the head of the serpent. So David doesn't he bruises the head, we could say, right? There's debate. How did Goliath die? Was it with the stone or was it with the sword? It's a moot point, right? It is damage to the head that is covered in bronze armor. He then takes his own sword and he chops his head off. Yeah, Don.
It says that he killed him both times.
Does it say that?
Yes.
Interesting.
He killed him with the stone and then he kills him with the sword.
That's it. I never caught that detail. That's good stuff. That is good stuff. Now think about it. I've told you all my dad is scared to death snakes. I mean, I've always joked that I think Dad, and he will say it's true, and I really think he believes this. Every snake, at least the ones he interacts with, are personally possessed by Satan himself. Every single one of them, okay? And I've told this story. It was on, if you were on the search committee, you would have had to hear this sermon, this illustration, because it was on one of my DVDs. So here you go, Betty and Mary and Mark. When I was a teenager, a middle schooler, I had a teacher who now is at TFCA. It's Mr. Markham. He had snakes. He still has snakes in his room. And I love those snakes. Just loved it. And he actually gave me the snake skin when they shed it, and my dad was furious. I don't want no snake skin. I don't want no Satan in my house. Made me throw it away. It just broke my heart. Anyway, so I got used to being around snakes. The more you're around snakes, the less you're terrified of them. Well, Dad and I were cleaning out the garage, and there was a snake underneath the shovel. And Dad immediately just, started paying. It's just a little garter snake. And I thought, well, I'll come around. We were in tight space. I'll come around the car, and I'll just pick up the snake. We'll throw it over the fence. That's our way of saying it's not our problem anymore. It's, 2 feet that way, but it's off our property. And by the time I got around, Dad had taken that shovel, and he hit the snake right over its head and chopped it off. And they, dug a hole into the concrete floor. I mean, he wanted the thing dead. And that's when, I don't expect you all to remember the sermon I did, but he took the shovel, threw it over the fence, and he came back to me and said, the only good snake is a dead snake, right? And, well, Dad, like all of us, if you're going to kill a snake, you're going to chop its head off. What does David do? He goes, chops his head off. That's what you do with snakes.
And he kept the snake skin.
Yeah. Of course, he sheds Saul's skin, because remember, it too is bronze. It's serpentine, and I don't need that, right? Of course, Saul becomes a type of snake. By the way, I think I took it out of my notes. Saul had a war early on in his ministry. He fought a king named Nahash. You know what Nahash, that word, means in Hebrew? Literally, snake. He fought King Snake. Later on in the story of David in 2 Samuel, I think we'll look at this later this year, David fights the son of King Nahash. He literally wars against the seed of the serpents, and he wins. I mean, come on. Okay, one last thing about Goliath, and we got to wrap this up. His legacy is that it is serpentine. Later prophets interpret the narrative in this manner. So Habakkuk 3, you went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. Talking about the David story. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked. Notice that language from Genesis 3:15. You crushed his head. Laying him bare from thigh to neck. Selah, I usually don't read Selah because I think it's a musical note that means pause for emphasis. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. This language, particularly Hebrew, is picking up the Goliath narrative and is saying that you've crushed that serpent, you will do the same thing in the future in Christ when he's raised from the dead. So why does all that matter? It's because the story of David and Goliath, and we'll have fun with this next week, the story of David and Goliath is ultimately about Jesus. It is not about you. And we make that habit over and over again. We think, okay, it's about me slaying my giants, poverty, sickness, in-laws, whatever it might be, when really it is about Jesus defeating giants. It's about Jesus defeating the supernatural. It is about Jesus defeating the serpents. It's not about you. It's about Jesus. If you're in the story, you're the cowards among the army who know you can't beat them. So what we need is a champion, one who stands between the armies, and he comes to fight and slay and to crush the serpents, no matter how giant and powerful they might be. So when Jesus marches in and he is casting out demons, he is waging war against the giants. He is waging war against the serpents. And they bruised his heel at the cross, but he crushed their head by using their own weapon of death against them through the empty tomb. That's the beauty of the story. We'll look more at it next week. Okay. Anything you guys have in your reading or this text or anything? All right. Well, let's